So cultural values of fire relationship and fire suppression or persevering for preparedness?
So our elders tell us that we were in relationship with the elements, one of those being fire, and so the element of fire in the right time for the right purpose in the right relationship then was a way that we managed the landscape. So David Douglas was one of the first explorers that was sent here from uh, the the British Empire, and he was a botanist, so he came and did all the recordings about what he saw. And when he got up here to our country, he said that he could ride his horse forever through the forest and never worry about getting knocked off because it was so managed. And he also said that the forest was more beautiful than any park he'd ever seen in the UK. And that was due to the practice of cultural burning, which right now we call it cultural burning. Back then they probably didn't call it cultural burning, but they would just know that in the late winter, early spring, or late fall, early winter was a time to burn places that needed to be cleared out a little bit or clarified or reawakened for new growth. So a lot of the berry patches were burned in the late fall, and the root fields were burned when they needed to be, and the woods. We had a Jack Nesbitt is an author who's looked into a lot of that history, and he talks about the sketches that the early explorers made. And when they came to this country, they were looking for timber because they needed it for the forts and for railroads and all of that. And they didn't find good timber stands like they were looking for. They said that this isn't a good place for timber because there's a lot of clearing. And so when you see big stands of timber in our country, you know that that is post-contact. And pre-contact, we left wide open spaces so we could access game and our medicine and food plants would grow. And then we left dense thickets so that the animals had a place where they could go and give birth and take care of themselves the way that they needed to. But we managed the whole landscape for the good of everyone. Cultural burning is what we call it now because of the way that fire has come to be feared. And the history of that goes all the way back to as the colonization moved this way, then we had industries, railroads, timber, and mining. And they wanted to have their way with the landscape. And at that time, Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot were trying to preserve some lands for future generations. But being up against those industries was a tough fight. So they used the fear of fire as a political tool to get their way around conserving lands, which is a good thing, right? But that fear of fire then evolved into what we have today, where the forests are unmanaged by that ancient practice of cultural burning, and then overgrown, so that in the summertime when fires do happen, it's pretty devastating. The ancestors, when they managed the landscape with fire, didn't have to worry about what was going to come up later because they didn't have invasives. Now we have invasive species that, especially when those devastating summertime wildfires burn and clear the ground, that's fertile ground for the invasives to come in and start growing. The native species weren't used to that heat in the ground, that sterilization of the soil, and so they are last to arrive in bringing places back. And so the places where the wildfires are burning, then the invasives come in, and like I said before, that's just like compounding the problem with so many things. Right now, when we did our first cultural burn here, it was a lot of the kind of what we call cheatgrass, and it was about this tall, and we burned that whole spot, and we saw that the cheatgrass didn't come back the year after, but we got lamb's quarters. And lamb's quarters is a nitrogen fixer, a hyperaccumulator, and when we saw the lamb's quarters come in, which we hadn't seen before, then we just knew that somehow that was that was sleeping in the ground or whatever, and the fire was able to awaken it, and it took up space where the cheatgrass then wasn't able to take up space. So
So there's a resurgence of ethnobotanicals
yes.
with the
Yeah,
oh,
yeah, and we're working with a group of fuels management students and practitioners. They put in plots on our site to measure the biodiversity. So they put the plots in, they count the plant diversity, and this fall they'll come back and burn with us, and then next spring come back and measure the diversity again.
could you tell us about the fires that came through here the last few years you were saying earlier?
Yeah, I think the last one was in 2008, and you can see on the tree that that it left some marks. Ponderosa pine is pretty resilient to fire, especially out here where the fire wouldn't be able to get really, really big, you know, because the growth here isn't like out in the forest, some places where it's really thick and dry. The 2008 fire came through here, but in 2016 we had a bigger fire that swept through a lot of the reservation. I think that we have lost probably 2/3 of our landscape to wildfire in the last 10 years. So this is a ponderosa pine. You can see that it's been affected by fire, but it isn't too affected because ponderosa pine are pretty resilient, and we have all this low vegetation that's not going to lap up into the tree.
So how our ancestral teachings can light a path forward for us and our non-tribal communities?
Yeah, so we can see that fire suppression in the middle of summer isn't working, and if we could go back to how our ancestors were able to use fire in the right time in the right places, could be a tool to mitigate some of the problems that we're seeing. We do have the fear of fire to treat, I guess, before we can bring that back in a bigger way.